Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. The coalition government's austerity package is under concerted attack. At the end of this week, the TUC plan to lead a demonstration of hundreds of thousands in opposition to the cuts programme, only 20% of which has so far been implemented. Perhaps more surprisingly, the IMF has abandoned its previous stance and given the government the unwelcome message that its economic policies are jeopardising the chances of recovery. Let's have a look at what George Osborne had to say about the government's austerity measures at the Conservative Party conference last week.
We have to find greater savings in the welfare bill. £10 billion of welfare savings by the first full year of the next Parliament. The higher interest rates would pick the very pockets of the working people you're trying to help, and the fear of extra taxes would undermine their confidence. In other words, our critics would gamble everything: our credibility, our financial stability, our low interest rates, the cost of our debt. They would risk everything on the dubious idea that a few billion more of spending would dramatically improve the fortunes of the £1.5 trillion British economy. Western democracies like ours are being outworked, outcompeted, outsmarted by these new economies. And the question for countries like Britain is this: are we going to sink or swim? And the truth is, some Western economies, some Western countries won't keep up. They won't make the changes needed to welfare and education and tax. They'll fall further and further behind. They'll become poorer and poorer. I am determined that will not be the Britain I leave to my children or you leave to yours. Thank you.
So, just as the Tories move to the right at their conference, is their economic policy about to hit the buffers? With me to discuss the prospects are James Meadway, Senior Economist at the New Economics Foundation, Ali Azim, Co-Chairman of the Conservative City Future, and a former policy advisor to George Osborne. And we have on the phone Dr. Richard Wellings, who's Deputy Editorial Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the programme. So, Ali, our critics, George Osborne referred to them, he didn't really realise that that was going to mean the IMF, did he?
Well, I mean, in fairness, with the IMF, you've got to also understand that over the past few years, they very strongly supported what the government's been doing in terms of deficit reduction. So, I mean, yeah, you're not exactly going to have everybody necessarily on side all the time, but they have maintained for quite some time that deficit reduction is the path to go down. Yeah, but
they reversed out that stance. That's the shock, isn't it, of the IMF news, that They said one thing, that agreed with the government, and now they're saying a completely different thing, which is at variance by about 180 degrees with what the government's doing.
But we can't just look at only what the IMF is saying. There are also the factors of rating agencies who are keeping a very keen eye on these sort of factors. And the simple fact is that we have got a very, very strong part of our economy which is based on the financial services. And by jeopardising that, we jeopardise the long-term recovery.
James, it must have been happy news that a job opportunity is opening up at the IMF for you and people who've been saying this for a while.
It's nice, isn't it? I can pack my bags and leave for Washington forthwith. No, of course, in the case of the IMF, this is reality finally catching up with them. It beggars belief that organisations that would claim, whatever else you might think about them, to have some sort of economic credibility, like the IMF, like actually the Treasury here and George Osborne's own department, that would claim to have some sort of economic credibility, have repeated, essentially for the last 2 years, a fairy story about austerity and what austerity can do for economies in the dire situation that many of them are now in as a result, really, of the financial crash of 2008. Now, the IMF has reversed its own estimates on the likely impact of spending cuts, of austerity on economies. It now suggests really quite strongly that it's a bad idea if you're suffering from weak growth or you're in recession. This is, of course, a story that many, many economists could have told them. In fact, anyone picking up a basic textbook, an A-level textbook, textbook in economics, flicking to the first page on macroeconomics, would have found a story that says, if you're in a recession, don't implement spending cuts of the kinds that George Osborne's been pushing through. So I think the IMF is doing something perhaps to try and restore its credibility. It's a bit too late for the people of Greece, for the people of Portugal, for Spain, for the other countries already suffering austerity measures. And of course, it's a bit too late for many of us here who have now lost jobs. It's certainly too late for those who suffered very directly from spending cuts and the welfare cuts that Osborne was talking about. The many suicides, for example, of those people who have been cut off from disability living allowance. This is the real human cost of austerity that the IMF, OK, doesn't talk about, but at least identifies the economic cost.
Let me bring in Dr. Richard Wellings. Welcome to the programme, Richard. Is this the moment where the IMF flipped over from monetarism, from the idea that if you keep cutting back, the economy will get better, into some kind of left or Keynesian analysis that says, no, this isn't working, we've got to spend some money to get out of this?
I don't think so. I think really the IMF does risk losing credibility if it constantly changes its viewpoint. I mean, really the IMF is more of a political organisation than an economic one, so I don't really place much credence on his comments.
Well, wasn't it in fact John Maynard Keynes himself who said, when the facts change, I change my mind, what do you do?
Well, I mean, we shouldn't draw too much from short-term economic data, because economic recoveries can take a very long time to take hold, and it's often due to the historical experience, so the fact that we had a very prolonged boom period starting off in the early 1990s, so we'd expect a prolonged slump now because of the huge excesses of credit creation in the last few years.
Well, there's prolonged and there's no way out. Isn't that really what the IMF is saying? They've revised their figures down by quite considerable amounts, especially in the case of Britain, and they're saying, look, what we said before just simply doesn't marry up with the facts.
Well, certainly fiscal stimulus and more government spending is definitely not a way out. I mean, the budget deficit is now at very, very dangerous levels, and there's a danger if it goes up any further, we could end up in a Greek-style debt crisis if the bond markets start to lose confidence in the UK. This could happen very quickly. So really, the government hasn't got much room for manoeuvre. It really has to live within its means as far as possible.
Ali, don't you think it's about time that this language was replaced? I mean, Richard says, that the bond markets lose faith in the UK, but isn't it really that the UK is losing faith in the bond markets, at least as far as the vast majority of ordinary people are concerned?
I mean, the simple fact is, I don't think that's necessarily a fair analysis. If you look at what our situation is, we are far more focused on financial services. Now, some people have said we're still in a recession, in a technical recession, as compared to someone like Germany or France. But and from that on its own, it might sound as if, okay, clearly we should be doing what Germany's doing. But Germany is a different economy. If you look at where their growth has come, it hasn't actually even been from more investment. In fact, investment's gone down. The real place where the growth has come from has been from higher exports to China because of their strong car manufacturing business, and increased spending by people within the country because there's more jobs. Now, under the current plans and what's been happening, what we've seen is an additional 1,000 jobs being created in the private sector. That's actually something that can translate to a benefit from what we've seen in Germany. But we don't have the same manufacturing industry. So we need to make sure we're protecting our financial services, which are the best in the world, because they make up such a high amount of tax revenue.
James, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's an honest statement of the case for this government and its economic proposals, because really they make very little sense from the point of view of let's deliver growth, let's create jobs, let's try and, to use the phrase that appears to be dropping out of fashion, rebalance the economy, try and shift it towards more manufacturing jobs. So I think it's an honest statement of the case for defending financial services. And of course we do defend and protect financial services, whether it's David Cameron himself walking out of EU deals just before Christmas last year that might have slightly nibbled away at some of the many privileges that the City of London that financial services enjoy. And of course the total cost for the bailouts, the biggest protection we offer to financial service industry. Mervyn King's estimate, this is the Governor of the Bank of England, suggests the total liability there is about £1.3 trillion. So we do very, very well. It's very kind of us to support financial services in this way, but it's a complete misnomer to think that we get very much out of it on the other side. A credible estimate prepared by University of in Manchester Business School, group of researchers there, for the amount of tax revenue we got during the boom years of the 2000s from financial services. If you add up everything, income tax, corporation tax, CGT, the works, you get something over £200 billion. You get about £250 billion. Now, that's a lot. It's just nowhere near as much as what you have to fork out when the financial service industry trips over itself and then threatens, of course, the entire global economy, which is what happened in 2008. So this idea that we gain something from financial services, from Britain having a very large, bloated financial services industry, I think is something that we need to start dealing with. We need to take on this idea and say, look, there has to be a different, better way of running the economy than the kind of paper shuffling exercise, which is what passes for activity in the City of London. This is no way to run an economy for the benefit of most ordinary people. We have to do something different. We could use this recession and this crisis to do something different. Part of that would be government directly intervening and saying we will invest to create jobs, we will create new industries. That is precisely the way that other countries faced with sharp recessions, faced with deep economic crises, have been able to pull themselves out. It is, of course, precisely not what George Osborne's prepared to do.
Richard, what do you make of the probably one of the more eye-catching figures to be extrapolated from the IMF study, that for every £1 of cuts, we're taking a maximum of £1.70 out of the economy? I mean, most ordinary people will understand those kind of figures and think that it's the economics of the madhouse.
I don't think those figures are at all credible. I mean, other people have come out with completely different estimates. One of the problems with fiscal stimulus or carried increased government spending, of course, is that people realise that taxes are going to have to rise in the future to pay for them eventually. So there's no free lunch. And this expectation of tax rises in the future, notwithstanding also the threat of some kind of Greek-style meltdown from higher spending, actually deter confidence. And then this in turn undermines private sector investment, which is the key to a recovery. So there are a lot of dangers here. Of course, the other issue is that stimulus programs mean that more and more workers and more businesses become dependent on state handouts. And once the recovery gets going, eventually it's very difficult to withdraw that. So you see a ratcheting up in the size of government, and this is, of course, very bad long-term for the economy.
Ali, most people listening to those figures will say, well, that's exactly what has been happening. That's why we're in such a mess. If the opposite were true, if it's true what Richard said, that cutting back, then we'd be back in growth already.
Well, no, I think there's a couple of points, and actually I'd like to pick up on a couple of points you mentioned earlier. The estimates of how much is actually contributed by the city is, that sounds like a very conservative estimate compared to what it actually is. But if you want to increase on manufacturing, you don't do that by reducing down on areas where we're actually making money right now.
No, I mean, the critical problem here is that we're not making money. That's the fallacy that people get themselves tied up with.
I disagree with those numbers. They don't sound, well, they're not in the same factor as from what I've seen other numbers. But a further point is that it's not just about the financial services that we're talking about. If we had a change in our credit rating, it doesn't just impact the financial services. It impacts interest rates. As cost of borrowing increases, it means that all the banks will have to increase their interest rates. Now, there are plenty of families, and I would count myself as one of them, who really are probably finding a bit of a reprise from the fact that there are lower interest rates, and therefore the payments that we're making on our mortgages are a bit lower, which means that we're able to get through. Now, you can't expect that to stay the same if you suddenly start borrowing a lot more, and that's why we have to be balanced. However, having said that, there is investment. There's already, I believe, 50 billion being pledged to further investment, 10 billion of which is going to be new housing being built up. You've got a new green bank that's planning to go forwards, which should, once up and running, be bringing in 16 billion pounds worth of funding for deals for new technologies. You've got 21 new enterprise zones being created, which will create more and more jobs. And you've even got a regional growth fund, which aims to, if implemented correctly, will bring about 100,000 new jobs. These are the sort of things which are credible that you really need to do.
So are you saying then, this revised estimate says that, from the IMF, says that there's going to be negative growth, there's going to be a shrinkage of the economy by 0.4%. Are you saying that we'll be able to sit here in 12 months, look at, because of the measures that you've outlined, say, the IMF got it wrong. Actually, what would you say as a result? There's going to be 1%, 2% growth in the economy.
I would be hesitant to say what sort of growth it is. I think that's something perhaps for more the real economic pundits who really study these sort of things. But I do believe that we are in a position where things can get better. We have stabilised the economy. That's actually a bigger thing than a lot of people realise. We were. But
the IMF's point is that we haven't. The IMF's point is that it's shrinking.
It's shrinking by a far smaller amount than what it could have been shrinking. I mean, we are in a situation where it is a financial crisis, and we are overly exposed to financial services. So you do have a situation where, okay, if anyone's going to be hit hard by it, it's probably going to be us. And we do need to rebalance that, and I take your point on that. I completely agree. We do want more manufacturing. In fact, my wife's got a jewellery company, and we do a lot of buying and selling off that sort of stuff in the UK, and I think that it is the way to start pushing things forward.
Well, we wish you luck with that,
thank you.
And we hope that it hauls the British economy out of the,
yes,
out of the slump,
but
perhaps not. I mean, James, these figures the British figures are exactly the same as the IMF's prediction for the euro area as a whole.
Yes,
so,
that's right.
So it isn't even that we'll be doing particularly badly; it's the whole place is doing badly.
Oh, I mean, everywhere looks pretty grim at the moment. I mean, that's certainly everywhere that's in the Western world, as was, you know, the kind of Eurozone, North America in general. None of it looks particularly healthy. It's just that if you start to pick out the bits that are really weak, and the bits are storing up real problems for at least the medium term, then Britain starts to really leap out at you in a number of different ways. I mean, it takes some doing to have a 30% devaluation in the value of the pound. The pound has fallen by about 30% in the last 2-3 years or so, and then to still ratchet up the widest current account deficit, you know, on record. That means that we're importing far more stuff and really not selling abroad. This isn't the march of the makers that George Osborne and David Cameron promised. This is indicative of deep problems in the British economy. And of course, if you dig out the Bank of England's most recent quarterly review of the economy, it talks about British productivity. Productivity growth matters to capitalist economies because this is what delivers all the other good stuff that you might want. This is what creates a space for economic growth. This is where you get more value, more wealth created. Now, British productivity growth has not recovered in the way that you might have anticipated after a very sharp recession like we suffered over 2008, 2009. Germany, France, other places has picked up somewhat. Britain is still languishing around here somewhere. That indicates very, very deep structural problems. Not of the kind, I suspect, that maybe Richard from the Institute of Economic Affairs might point to, that would talk about, well, we have to get rid of red tape, we have to cut taxes even further, we have to make sure the rich have even more money than they do already so they can invest it all for us. Actually, I think it points to different sets of problems that are long-term, that are structural, that trace back in the first instance to Margaret Thatcher's destruction of manufacturing industry, the weaknesses of British infrastructure. Dieter Helm, professor at Oxford, estimates that we'd need to spend about £500 billion on infrastructure over the next 10 years to get it up to a kind of Western European standard. All of this requires money. All of this requires spending money. It is not good enough to have a government that says our sole response to the crisis, the only thing that us and the Lib Dem partners that we're together with can really agree on is austerity, austerity, austerity. And when you get something like the IMF, who are many things, but are certainly not a cabal of secret leftists, put it that way, saying that austerity isn't going to work, it hasn't worked, it isn't going to work, and we need to think seriously about what we're doing here, it's time for a major U-turn on the part of this government. It's time to say austerity hasn't worked, we have to spend to get out of this mess.
Richard, just let me ask you what you make of the American figures, because in a pretty grim forecast overall, actually the IMF revised the figures for American growth upwards. The American economy is doing better than they thought, and this comes at a time when in the presidential elections Obama is being criticised by the Republican right for the "we save General Motors" approach to the economy. What do you make of it?
Well, it's important to interpret the American figures correctly. One of the distortions, of course, is they have quite significant population growth of almost 1% a year. So in order for them just to stay in the same place, they have to grow their GDP by about 1% a year. So that makes a difference. Also, there are big questions about whether US inflation rates are being reported accurately. A lot of people think they're actually underestimating those rates, which in turn leads them to overestimate their GDP growth rates. And the other factor, of course, is that they entered the recession very quickly. They were, in a sense, the first country in there at the heart of the crisis, which means you'd expect them to be one of the first countries to come out of recession. So there are a lot of different factors there, and I think it's a dangerous place too much credence on short-term GDP figures. And the other factor, of course, compared to the UK, perhaps their financial sector isn't quite as big as the share of the economy is in the UK, and they didn't have quite as big a credit boom as you saw in the UK and indeed places like Ireland and Spain.
James, what do you make of the American figures?
Well, I agree certainly with the last part of what Richard was saying there, that the credit boom wasn't quite as deranged in America as it became over here, where essentially to compensate for what is underlying all of this, really quite a weak economy, and we now have the figures for this, that over the decade of the boom, the real median incomes, that's average incomes, the indicator for what most households are actually getting, basically stagnated, and this was compensated for by borrowing on a very, very wide scale. I mean, if you take Britain's total debt position, the debt of all its households, all its companies, including the banks and its government, it has the worst debt position of any developed country now, which is another major problem for this. Now, of course, the bulk of that debt is, of course, from financial corporations. It's quite a different picture in America. America is probably in a better place than Britain for a whole number of reasons related to that. It's a far bigger economy for a start, and that just kind of sets a natural floor to the sort of decline you might be experiencing. But to simply talk about the recession we're in, and I think this is the implication of what Richard is saying, as if it's cyclical, as if it's just you have a boom, then you have a slump, and then you have a boom again, I don't think is good enough. We have to talk about really deep structural problems across the developed capitalist world now. One of those structural problems has become an excessive dependence on the creation of credit, on blowing up enormous debt bubbles. Now, either you find a way to produce growth, to do economic activity that doesn't always depend on blowing up credit bubbles and then hoping for the best, and of course these things collapse, as we saw in 2008, or we're stuck with stagnation for the foreseeable future. And that is the kind of prospect that I think that's certainly opening up for Europe, certainly opening up for the UK. The IMF estimates, by the way, I suspect will be too optimistic for next year. They're forecasting a return to not brilliant growth, but a return to growth of about 1%. As things stand, I don't see that happening.
Ali, I mean, whatever else James and Richard have been differing on, they do seem to be saying that one of the factors that's allowed the US slightly greater degree of growth is a lesser dependence on the financial sector. But you've been arguing that we've got to defend the financial sector.
Well, absolutely. I mean,
doesn't it sound like you're digging us into a deeper hole?
It's not at all. I mean, what you've got to realise is that we are in the situation that we are in right now. To suddenly cut down this financial services will not help us, it will hinder us quite considerably, because that's where a lot of jobs currently are, that's where a lot of tax revenues are coming from. And it's not just from the financial services, it's also from all the industries that support the financial services too, right? I do agree that we do want to have a rebalancing in the economy, but that will never ever work by just trying to cut something else down so that it averages down. You want to bring other things up. That's the way that you need to do it. And I perfectly agree with you on the fact that we do need more investment. And that was the job of the Labour government when we were in a boom time. We should have taken that money, put it into investment. Instead, we ended up in a situation where, as was said previously, the cupboards were bare when we got into office. There wasn't that room to play with. Trust me, I'm as strong a Keynesian as anyone else when it comes to a downtime. I do believe that demand-side economics work when you're in a slump. I believe that. But at the same time, if you don't have the money for it, you will only end up in a situation where you'll be pushing up interest rates, reducing stability. People will lose their homes because they won't necessarily have enough money to buy them. We're already seeing an increase in the age that people are actually able to get homes. These are the sort of things that we want in our economy. And so you've got to do what's right for not only the financial services, but the people in general by keeping interest rates low and the country stable. And that's exactly what this government has done. And it's only done that because it managed to reduce the deficit by a quarter, which was what was needed in order to get the confidence back into the rating agencies. I
mean, James, there's one thing there which is undeniable, isn't it? Which is that New Labour swallowed the whole neoliberal economic argument absolutely as much as the Tories.
Oh, entirely. I mean, this has been how the dominant way to think about how an economy works and the kind of economic policies that you implement. It's been dominant for 20, 30 years now. It's basically my entire lifetime. This has been how we're supposed to do things. Now, what it's degenerated into is something along the lines of hold down real wages, hold down real incomes, allow banks and other financial institutions to create loans and distribute those loans, and this will keep economic activity growing. And New Labour bought into that wholesale. failed, but then so did everyone else. I mean, this was the boom of the 2000s, driven by a credit bubble. Now, just to pick up on this point about interest rates, look, the issue of interest rates, why are they low at the moment? It's very simple, because the government has intervened massively in the bond markets through quantitative easing. £375 billion worth of government debt it has bought. That is what is forcing down interest rates. Nothing to do with credibility or confidence, but directly government intervention.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sure we'll be returning to the cause of the economic crisis again in future editions of the Politics and Media programme, but in the second half we'll be looking at the impact of the austerity programme on ordinary people.